Hi, I'm Pranamya, and you're watching Pages of the Globe. So, if you're new to my channel, I'm Pranamya, and I read short stories on this channel, and I give you an analysis about them. I tell you a little bit about the author, I tell you about the historical context of the story, and how you can apply it to the real world today. If you want to know more about my channel, please check out the intro video that I have posted. It should be pinned on my page. But yeah, without further ado, let's get on with the introduction. So the story that I'm going to be reading today is The Killers by Ernest Hemingway. Now before I jump straight to the story, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the author. Born on July 21st, 1899 in Illinois, Hemingway was the second of 6 children. Now, as for his career beginning, he started his career as a journalist. After high school, he actually worked for the Kansas City Star, which greatly influenced his writing style, emphasizing short, straightforward sentences. He actually served for an ambulance driver for the Red Cross during World War I and was seriously wounded. His experiences during the war inspired his novel A Farewell to Arms. As for his literary style, Hemingway is known for his economical and understated style, often referred to as the iceberg theory or the theory of omission, where the underlying meaning is implied rather than explicitly stated. As for his major works, some of his most famous works include The Sun Also Rises, A Farewell to Arms, For Whom the Bell Tolls, and The Old Man and the Sea, the last of which actually won a Pulitzer Prize in 1953. Now, as for his some of the prizes that he won, he actually was awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1954 for his mastery of the art of narrative, most recently demonstrated in The Old Man and the Sea, and for the influence he exerted on contemporary style. Now, he did have a very turbulent personal life marked by 4 marriages and numerous affairs. As for his death, he died by suicide on July 2nd, 1961 in Idaho. He struggled with depression and other mental health issues throughout his life. He underwent electroconvulsive therapy, which some believe contributed to his declining mental state. His health had been deteriorating and he was deeply affected by his mental health struggles when he died by suicide. As for his legacy, Hemingway's influence on literature is very profound. His distinctive styles and themes, bravery, loss, and grace under pressure have left a lasting impact on readers worldwide. Without further ado, let's get on with the story, but before that, actually, let me tell you a little bit about the story we're going to be reading. So, the short story that I'm going to be reading today is The Killers by Ernest Hemingway. Now, The Killers is a very interesting short story. It's mostly known because it has this almost strange type of literary style to it, which makes it in the beginning seem very interesting, and at one point you're almost where is the story going? You don't really understand it, and you really have to do almost a deep dive and go line by line to really understand exactly what the story is trying to tell us, what the message is here. Without further ado, let's get on with the story. Remember to like, share, subscribe, and comment down below which short story you would like me to read next. The Killers by Ernest Hemingway. The door of Henry's lunchroom opened, and 2 men came in. They sat down at the counter. "What's yours?" George asked them. "I don't know," one of the men said. "What do you want to eat, Al?" "I don't know," said Al. "I don't know what I want to eat." Outside, it was getting dark. The street light came on outside the window. The 2 men at the counter read the menu. From the other end of the counter, Nick Adams watched them. He had been talking to George when they came in. "I'll have a roast pork tenderloin with applesauce and mashed potatoes," the first man said. "It isn't ready yet." "What the hell do you put it on the card for?" "That's the dinner," George explained. "You can get it at 6 o'clock. George looked at the clock on the wall behind the counter. "It's 5 o'clock. "The clock says 20 minutes past 5, the second man said. "It's 20 minutes fast." "Oh, to hell with the clock," the first man said. "What have you got to eat?" "I can give you any kind of sandwiches," George said. "You can have ham and eggs, bacon and eggs, liver and bacon, or a steak." "Give me the chicken croquettes with the green peas and the cream sauce and the mashed potatoes." "That's the dinner. Everything we want is the dinner, huh? That's the way you work it? I can give you ham and eggs, bacon and eggs, liver. I'll take ham and eggs, the man called Al said. He wore a derby hat and a black overcoat, buttoned across the chest. His face was small and white, and he had tight lips. He wore a silk muffler and gloves. Give me bacon and eggs, said the other man. He was about the same size as Al. Their faces were different, but they were dressed like twins. Both wore overcoats too tight for them. They sat leaning forward, their elbows on the counter. Got anything to drink? Silver beer, bevo, ginger ale, George said. I mean, you got anything to drink? Just those, I said. This is a hot town, said the other. What do they call it? Summit. Ever heard of it? Al asked his friend. No, said the friend. What do they do here nights? Al asked. They eat the dinner, his friend said. They all come here and eat the big dinner. That's right, George said. So you think that's right? Al asked George. Sure. You're a pretty bright boy, aren't you? Sure, said George. Well, you're not, is he, Al? He's dumb, said Al. He turned to Nick. What's your name? Adams. Another bright boy, Al said. Ain't you a bright boy, Max? The town's full of bright boys, Max said. George put down the two platters, one of ham and eggs and the other of bacon and eggs, on the counter. He set down two side dishes of fried potatoes and closed the wicket into the kitchen. Which is yours? He asked Al. Don't you remember? Ham and eggs. Just a bright boy, Max said. He leaned forward and took the ham and eggs. Both men ate with their gloves on. George watched them eat. What are you looking at? Max looked at George. Nothing. The hell you were. You were looking at me. Maybe the boy meant it for a joke, Max, Al said. George laughed. You don't have to laugh, Max said to him. You don't have to laugh at all, see? All right, said George. So he thinks it's all right. Max turned to Al. He thinks it's all right. That's a good one. Oh, he's a thinker, Al said. They went on eating. What's the bright boy's name down the corner? Al asked Max. Hey, bright boy, Max said to Nick. You go around to the other side of the counter with your boyfriend. What's the idea? Nick asked. There isn't any idea. You better go around, bright boy, Al said. Nick went around behind the counter. What's the idea? George asked. None of your damn business, Al said. Who's out in the kitchen? The black guy? What do you mean the black guy? The black guy that cooks. Tell him to come in. What's the idea? Tell him to come in. Where do you think you are? We know damn well where we are, the man called Max said. Do we look silly? You talk silly, Al said to him. What the hell do you argue with this kid for? Listen, he said to George. Tell the black guy to come out here. What are you going to do to him? Nothing. Use your head, bright boy. What would we do to a black guy? George opened the slit that opened back into the kitchen. Sam, he called, come in here a minute. The door to the kitchen opened, and the black guy came in. What is it? He asked. The two men at the counter took a look at him. All right, black boy, you stand right there, Al said. Sam, the black guy, standing in his apron, looked at the two men sitting at the counter. Yes, sir, he said. Al got down from his stool. I'm going back to the kitchen with the black boy and the bright boy, he said. Go on back to the kitchen, black boy. You go with him, bright boy. The little man walked after Sam and Nick, the cook, back into the kitchen. The door shut after them. The man called Max sat at the counter opposite George. He didn't even look at George, but looked in the mirror that ran along the back of the counter. Henry's had been made over a saloon into a lunch counter. Well, bright boy, Max said, looking into the mirror, why don't you say something? What's it all about? Hey, Al, Max called. Bright boy wants to know what it's all about. Why don't you tell him? Al's voice came from the kitchen. What do you think it's about? I don't know. What do you think? Max looked into the mirror all the time he was talking. I wouldn't say. Hey, Al, bright boy says he wouldn't say what he thinks it's all about. I can hear you all right, Al said from the kitchen. He had propped open the slit that dishes passed through into the kitchen with a catsup bottle. Listen, bright boy, he said from the kitchen to George. Stand a little further along the bar. You move a little to the left, Max. He was like a photographer arranging for a group picture. Talk to me, bright boy, Max said. What do you think is going to happen? George did not say anything. I'll tell you, Max said. We're going to kill a Swede. Do you know a big old Swede named Ole Anderson? Yes. He comes here to eat every night, don't he? Sometimes he comes here. He comes here at 6 o'clock, don't he? If he comes. We know all that, bright boy, Max said. Talk about something else. Ever go to the movies? Once in a while. You ought to go to the movies more. The movies are fine for a bright boy like you. What are you going to kill old Anderson for? What did he ever do to you? He never had a chance to do anything to us. He's never seen us. And he's only going to see us once, Al said from the kitchen. What are you going to kill him for? We're killing him for a friend. Just to oblige a friend, bright boy. Shut up, Al said from the kitchen. You talk too much. Well, I gotta keep the bright boy amused, don't I, bright boy? You talk too much, Al said. The black boy and my bright boy are amused by themselves. I got them tied up like a couple of girlfriends in the convent. I suppose you were in a convent. You never know. You were in a kosher convent. That's where you were. George looked up at the clock. If anybody comes in, tell them the cook is off. And if they keep after it, you tell them you'll go to the back and cook yourself. Do you get that, bright boy? All right, George said. What are you going to do with us afterward? That'll depend, Max said. That's one of those things you never know at the time. George looked up at the dock. It was 6:15. The door from the street opened. A streetcar motorman came in. Hello, George, he said. Can I get supper? Sam's gone out, George said. He'll be back in about half an hour. I'd better go up the street, the motorman said. George looked at the clock. It was 6:20. That was nice, bright boy, Max said. You're a regular little gentleman. He knew I'd blow his head off, Al said from the kitchen. No, said Max, it ain't that. He's nice. He's a nice boy. I like him. At 6:55, George said, he's not coming. Two other people had been in the lunchroom. One, George had gone out to the kitchen and made a ham and egg sandwich to go that a man wanted to take with him. Inside the kitchen, he saw Al, his derby hat tipped back, sitting on a stool beside the wicket with the muzzle of a sawed-off shotgun resting on the ledge. Nick and the cook were back-to-back in the corner, a towel tied in each of their mouths. George had cooked the sandwich, wrapped it up in oiled paper, and put it in a bag and brought it in, and the man had paid for it and gone out. Bright boy can do everything, Max said. He can cook and everything. You'd make a girl a nice wife, bright boy. Yes, George said. Your friend, Ole Anderson, isn't going to come. We'll give him 10 minutes, Max said. Max watched the mirror and the clock. The hands of the clock marked 7 o'clock, then 5 minutes past 10. Come on, Al, said Max. We better go. He's not coming. Better give him 5 minutes, Al said from the kitchen. In another 5 minutes, a man came in. George explained that the cook was sick. Why the hell don't you got another cook? The man asked. Aren't you running a lunch counter? He went out. Come on, Al, Max said. What about the two bright boys and the black boy? They're all right. You think so? Sure, we're through with it. I don't like it, said Al. It's sloppy. You talk too much. Oh, what the hell, said Max. We gotta keep 'em amused, haven't we? You talk too much all the same, Al said. He came out of the kitchen. The cut-off barrels of the shotgun made a slight bulge under the waist of his too tight-fitting overcoat. He straightened his coat with gloved hands. So long, bright boy, he said to Max. You got a lot of luck. That's the truth. You ought to play the races, bright boy. The two of them went out the door. George watched them through the window, pass under the arc light and across the street. In their tight overcoats and derby hats, they looked like a vaudeville team. George went back through the swinging door into the kitchen and untied Nick and the cook. I don't want any more of that, said Sam the cook. I don't want any more of that. Nick stood up. He had never had a towel in his mouth before. Say, he said, what the hell? He was trying to swagger it off. They were going to kill Ole Anderson. They were going to shoot him when he came in to eat. Ole Anderson? Sure. The cook felt the corners of his mouth with his thumbs. They're all gone, he asked. Yeah, said George. They're gone now. I don't like it. I don't like any of it at all. Listen, George said to Nick, you better go see Ole Anderson. All right. You better not have anything to do with it at all, Sam the cook said. You better stay way out of it. Don't go if you don't want to, George said. Mixing up in this isn't going to get you anywhere, the cook said. You stay out of it. I'll go see him, Nick said to George. Where does he live? The cook turned away. Little boys always know what they want to do, he said. He lives up in Hirsch's rooming house, George said to Nick. I'll go up there. Outside, the arc light shone through with the bare branches of a tree. Nick walked up the street beside the car tracks and turned at the next arc light down a side street. 3 houses up the street was Hirsch's rooming house. Nick walked up the 2 steps and pushed the bell. A woman came to the door. Is Ole Anderson here? Do you want to see him? Yes, if he's in. Nick followed the woman up a flight of stairs and went to the back of the end of the corridor. She knocked on the door. Who is it? It's somebody to see you, Mr. Anderson, the woman said. It's Nick Adams. Come in. Nick opened the door and went to the room. Ole Anderson was lying on bed with all of his clothes on. He had been a heavyweight prize fighter, and he was too long for the bed. He lay with his head on 2 pillows. He did not look at Nick. What is it? He asked. I was up at Henry's, Nick said, and 2 fellows came in and tied me up and the cook, and they said they were going to kill you. It sounded silly when he said it. Ole Anderson said nothing. They put us out in the kitchen, Nick went on. They were going to shoot you when you came in to supper. Ole Anderson looked at the wall and said nothing. George thought I'd better come and tell you about it. There isn't anything I can do about it, Ole Anderson said. I'll tell you what they were like. I don't want to know what they were like, Ole Anderson said. He looked at the wall. Thanks for coming to tell me about it. That's all right. Nick looked at the big man lying on the bed. Don't you want me to go and see the police? No, Ole Anderson said. That wouldn't do any good. Isn't there something I could do? No, there ain't anything to do. Maybe it was just a bluff. No, it ain't a bluff. Ole Anderson rolled over toward the wall. The only thing is, he said, talking toward the wall, I just can't make my mind to go out. I've been here all day. Couldn't you get out of town? No, Ole Anderson said. I'm through with all that running around. He looked at the wall. There ain't anything to do now. Couldn't you fix it up some way? No, I got in wrong. He talked in the same flat voice. There ain't anything to do. After a while, I'll make up my mind to go out. I better go back and see George, Nick said. So long, said Ole Anderson. He did not look towards Nick. Thanks for coming around. Nick went out. As he shut the door, he saw Ole Anderson with all of his clothes on, lying on the bed looking at the wall. He's been in his room all day, the landlady downstairs said. I guess he don't feel well. I said to him, Mr. Anderson, you ought to go out and take a walk on a nice fall day like this. But he didn't feel it. He doesn't want to get out. I'm sorry he doesn't feel well, the woman said. He's an awfully nice man. He was in the ring, you know. I know it. You'd never know except for the way his face is, the woman said. They stood just inside the street door. He's just as gentle. Well, good night, Miss Hirsch, Nick said. Oh, I'm not Miss Hirsch, the woman said. She owns the place. I just look after it for her. I'm Miss Bell. Well, good night, Miss Bell, Nick said. Good night, the woman said. Nick walked up the dark street to the corner under the arc light and then along the car tracks to Henry's eating house. George was inside, back of the counter. Did you see Ole? Yes, said Nick. He's in his room and he won't go out. The cook opened the door from the kitchen when he heard Nick's voice. I don't even listen to it, he said, and shut the door. Did you tell him about it? Sure, I told him, but he knows what it's all about. What's he going to do? Nothing. They'll kill him. I guess they will. He must have gotten mixed up in Chicago. I guess so. It's a hell of a thing. It's an awful thing. They did not say anything. George reached down for a towel and wiped the counter. I wonder what he did, Nick said. Double-cross somebody. That's what they kill him for. I'm going to get out of this town, Nick said. Yes, that's a good thing to do. I can't stand to think about him, waiting in the room knowing he's going to get it. It's too damned awful. Well, said George, you better not think about it. The end. Alright, so that was The Killers by Ernest Hemingway. Now, before I tell you the analysis, I'm just going to give you a sort of quick summary. Now, in the story, what exactly happens? Well, the setting is sort of this lunch counter, and there is this man that's talking to George, the manager of a diner, and Nick Adams is the man talking to him. He watches two overdressed strangers, Al and Max, enter the diner. And they're kind of complaining about, like, the menu and the serving schedule. And then they just kind of jokingly, like, they sarcastically joking about how George and Nick are just kind of dumb country boys. Now, after they finish the meal, Al orders Nick and Sam, the black cook, to the kitchen, where they then tie them up. Meanwhile, Max is boasting to George that he and Al have been hired to kill old Anderson, an aging boxer, who they've heard eats dinner there every night. Now, when the boxer fails to show up, Al and Max leave, and George unties both of them. Then Nick goes over to Anderson's house to warn him of what's happening, but the boxer doesn't seem to be concerned at all, and he says he's tired of running. At the very end, he tells George and Sam that Nick comes back. He tells them about it, and then he says, I'm going to leave Summit because I can't bear to think about a man waiting passively to just be killed by a couple of hired killers. Now, something that's important to know with the story is that in the 1940s, when Hemingway's stories were beginning to be anthologized, Indian Camp and The Killers were two stories most often published in textbooks and literary anthologies. So I will be referring to Indian Camp a lot. I've never actually read it on my channel. I definitely will if you guys want me to. But yeah, pervading the story is a overwhelming mood of bleakness. We are at this sort of like small town lunch counter diner that's ironically called Summit, and like there's killers there, and then they leave, and in Ole's rented room, Ole just seems to be undisturbed by the fact that he is about to die. In fact, he seems as though he almost expected to hear about the plan to kill him. He tells Nick that he can't run any longer and that anything or nothing can be done about his situation. He sends Nick away. Interestingly, Ole is actually lying on his bed turned towards the wall in his room as he waits for his death, which is interesting because in Indian Camp, the young American Indian husband slits his throat while he is turned toward the wall lying in his bunk. Returning back to the diner, Nick begins to... Actually, you know what? Before I continue, I do want to tell you a little bit about Indian Camp and its connection to The Killers, because while, I mean, you could read The Killers, or you could read both of them, like, by themselves, I think having just a little bit of, like, understanding as what's happening it's a little helpful. So, in Indian Camp, there is actually Nick from the story in The Killers is the same as Nick from Indian Camp. However, in Indian Camp, there's a relationship between Nick and his father, who is a doctor who's called to an Indian camp to help deliver a baby. And in their relationship, the father and the son, Nick, have a very loving relationship. Even though Nick is actually very young at this point, they have a very close relationship. So I'm going to go back to talking about The Killers now. As I was saying, when they return back to the diner, Nick begins to tell George and the cook, who goes into the kitchen so he won't have to hear anything about the murder, what happened in Ole's apartment. And Nick says that he's going to leave town where a man passively awaits being gunned down, because that's just too terrible. Now, Nick can't stand it. In Indian Camp, Nick's father actually made a grave distinction between men who succumbed to fear and couldn't face dire adversity. They become suicidal weaklings, the ones who couldn't stand things. As a small boy, Nick vowed never to be one of these men. Now, something that I actually find very interesting is I talked about this in the beginning of the video, but Ernest Hemingway actually killed himself with a self-inflicted gunshot wound to his head. So I found this sort of sentiment very interesting. Now, going back to the story, ironically, Hemingway's story is actually not about the killers, even though that's the title. Nor is it about Ole Anderson, the prizefighter who is assumed it is killed. Rather, the story is about Nick Adams' confrontation with unmitigated evil, represented by the two gangsters, Al and Max. Note that we don't even know why the killers are murdering Anderson. George thinks that the prizefighter must have betrayed or double-crossed some gamblers. Ole simply says to Nick that he got in the wrong. The main concern, however, has little to do with Anderson or the killers. readers are far more concerned with Nick Adams' initiation, or exposure to evil and how he reacts to it. Hemingway uses no subtlety in characterizing Al and Max. They clearly represent the epitome of evil, almost as though they stepped out of a medieval mortality play. Their faces are not alike, yet they are dressed in identical black overcoats, black gloves, black of course being the most common and perhaps oldest symbol of evil. Seemingly, this episode in the diner is Nick Adams' first encounter with evil, killing done simply for the sake of killing, by men hired to kill who have no family, business, or emotional ties to their victim. Neither Al nor Max have even met Anderson, yet they plan to kill him coldly and impersonally. Nick's deep sense of responsibility is evident in his need to warn Anderson of the impending danger, and he is confused by Anderson's passive attitude. Considering the different kinds to evil, first there is the cook's reaction, who wants to close his eyes to the existence and pretend that it's not there. Then there's George, who recognizes that evil exists but sets someone else, Nick in this case, to deal with it. And then there's Anderson, who succumbs to the inevitable that is his fate. Finally, Nick Adams recognizes the horror of evil and attempts to do something about it, but when he cannot, he yearns to run away. Although he responds to evil and wants to do something about it, upon witnessing Ole doing absolutely nothing about it himself, Nick decides to leave town and ultimately surrenders to the threat of evil himself. Like in the American Indian husband in Indian Camp, a man who quote-unquote couldn't stand his wife's suffering, so Nick can't stand Ole Anderson's waiting in his room knowing that he's going to get it. Additionally, Nick also learns that the world is not always what it seems. For instance, the diner was built as a bar and still has some of the accoutrements. The clock and the menu don't reflect what time it is and what is being served. The killers look a little like Laurel and Hardy, although they are dressed in black. The boarding house owner is absent. She's not actually there, it's someone else. And these are all tiny details, especially the boarding house owner. I remember reading that and I was like, why is that even important? Like, why did Hemingway feel that it was important to include the fact that when Nick is leaving, he tells the lady that's at the boarding house, he tells her, "Oh, goodbye, Miss Hirsch," because it's called Miss Hirsch's boarding house. She's like, "Oh, no, I'm like someone else. Miss Hirsch isn't here today." And so, even though that's such a minute detail, it shows that the world is not always what it seems. There's always something else going on. Nick is also exposed to the heavyweight fighter who once fought for money but now refuses to fight, even for his life. Anderson clearly knows that the hired killers are going to murder him, but he's lost his will to fight. Ole, a prize fighter, isn't a fighter, and Nick isn't able to confront the evil as he thought he could. This attitude is, of course, unethical to the values what would develop as Hemingway's standard code hero, a man who must recognize death as the end of everything and must therefore struggle against this final nothingness. Fleeting evil is not an option for the typical code hero of Hemingway's later fiction. A man must confront evil, or in this case, Anderson's inevitable death, and he must try and understand it. Running from evil is as much a violation of the code hero's persona as suicide is. How one reacts to evil is ultimately more important than evil itself. Well, that is it for today. Remember to like, share, subscribe, and comment down below which short story you would like me to read next.